May 13th, 2026, 30 minutes. And everything you thought you knew about who is actually operating in the Strait of Hormuz just collapsed. Not the IRGC, not Iran's Mosquito fleet scattered across coastal launch points, not the diplomatic track running through Pakistani mediators, not the ceasefire that the American president himself described as being on massive life support. 30 minutes during which Chinese warships, a destroyer and 2 support vessels, altered course directly toward a United States carrier strike group in the most contested waterway on Earth, and held that course. Both sides went to battle stations. Fire control systems went active. Every sensor on every vessel locked onto the opposing formation. 30 minutes, during which hundreds of sailors on both sides performed the same silent calculation about what happens if one system malfunctions, one radio transmission is misread, or one junior officer makes a decision that cannot be recalled once made. 30 minutes that the Pentagon did not expect. That Beijing calculated precisely, and that Washington answered with a speed and coordination that visibly surprised the Chinese commanders who had modelled hesitation. Within 30 minutes, a coordinated American diplomatic and military response was already in motion. Regional partners contacted, assets repositioned, intelligence shared across allied networks in real time. The speed of that response is what the world needs to understand today. Because China did not stumble into this confrontation, China walked into it deliberately, with a message prepared and with a specific calculation about how Washington would respond. And Washington's actual response was not what Beijing's pre-mission modelling expected. That gap between what China calculated and what it got is now the most important strategic data point in the entire Hormuz theatre. But let's back all the way up. Because to understand why Chinese warships altering course toward an American carrier strike group in the Strait of Hormuz on this specific day represents something categorically different from every previous phase of this crisis, you need to understand what Beijing has been building toward for a decade, and why the Hormuz crisis created the opportunity it has been waiting for, to deliver a message that no diplomatic channel could transmit with equal clarity. Here is where things stand as of today. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through that 21-mile corridor flows nearly 20% of the world's entire seaborne oil supply, every single day. On one side, the Islamic Republic of Iran, with its coastal artillery, its dispersed Mosquito fleet of 500 to 1,000 fast attack craft, its cruise missile and drone inventories, and a command structure so fractured that regional unit commanders can act without authorization from Tehran. On the other side, one of the most formidable naval armadas the United States has assembled in any single theatre since the Cold War. 3 carrier strike groups, more than 200 fifth-generation combat aircraft, 15,000 naval personnel, Virginia-class nuclear submarines, and a kill chain specifically engineered over 75 days of active operations to handle every Iranian threat category the IRGC has deployed. That is the established picture, the picture that analysts, governments and markets have been tracking since Operation Epic Fury began on February 28th. And into that established picture on this specific day, China sent a destroyer and 2 support ships on a course that brought them into direct confrontation with the American formation. Not because Beijing is confused about what is happening in the Hormuz theatre, because Beijing has been watching it very carefully, and concluded that this specific moment, with American attention concentrated on the Iranian threat, with a ceasefire described as being on massive life support, with the diplomatic track and collapse, was the precise moment to deliver a message that would land with maximum strategic impact on every audience that matters. That is not improvisation. That is calculation. The sequence of events during those 30 minutes tells you more about Beijing's current strategic posture than any diplomatic communique or trade negotiation outcome could reveal. A U.S. Navy carrier strike group was conducting freedom of navigation operations in the Persian Gulf region. These operations are routine, legally grounded in international maritime law, conducted regularly to assert that international waters remain open to all nations under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Nothing unusual on the surface. But Chinese naval vessels, including at least one destroyer and 2 support ships, had been positioned in the broader Gulf region for several weeks prior to this incident. Beijing had publicly framed their presence as participation in anti-piracy cooperation and joint exercises with regional partners. On paper, it looked diplomatic. In reality, it was deliberate asset positioning by a military that does not move warships from the Pacific halfway across the world for piracy patrol. Everyone in the intelligence community understood this. Washington initially chose to monitor rather than confront. The moment things changed came just before dawn local time. The U.S. strike group was moving through the strait when Chinese warships altered course. Not gradually, not ambiguously. They turned directly toward the American formation at a speed that triggered immediate alerts on U.S. radar systems. Within seconds, radio communications were flying between both sides. American commanders demanded to know the intent of the Chinese vessels. The responses were cold, brief, and precisely calculated. Chinese naval officers, speaking in English over the open channel, informed the U.S. commander that they were conducting their own freedom of navigation exercise. They used almost identical language to what America uses when it describes its own freedom of navigation operations, word for word. That was not coincidence. That was deliberate provocation wrapped in diplomatic language. They were telling Washington, we can play this game too, in the same language you play it with. For the next 30 minutes, both naval groups maintained their course and speed on a trajectory that would have produced an extremely dangerous close encounter. US sailors at battle stations, fire control systems active, every sensor on every American vessel locked onto the Chinese ships, and every Chinese ship running the identical sensor configuration back at the American formation. 2 nuclear-capable navies pointing everything they have at each other in a corridor the size of a city, with hundreds of sailors on both sides performing the same calculation about what happens if one system malfunctions, one radio message is misread, one junior officer makes a decision without authorization that cannot be recalled once made. This is not a movie scenario. Not a tabletop exercise. This is the actual operational environment that existed in the Strait of Hormuz during those 30 minutes. The cold mathematics of what happens when 2 nuclear-capable superpowers lock weapons onto each other in a corridor that narrow. What happened next surprised even veteran military analysts. Washington did not back down, but it also did not escalate in the way Beijing expected. Instead, the US made a move that was simultaneously bold and precisely calibrated. American officials immediately contacted multiple regional partners, including key Gulf states, and within 30 minutes of the confrontation beginning, a coordinated diplomatic and military response was already executing. The speed of that response is the detail that shocked the world. The United States had clearly wargamed this scenario. They had a playbook ready. While Chinese commanders may have modeled hesitation from Washington, what they got was a precise, coordinated reaction demonstrating the American military and diplomatic machine can move very fast when it needs to. Regional allies began repositioning their own assets. Intelligence was shared in real time across multiple allied networks. Beijing has watched the United States operate in the Persian Gulf for decades, with a posture that functionally treats the waterway as an American-administered maritime zone. Freedom of navigation operations conducted with the confidence of a power that has never been seriously challenged in that theatre. Naval architecture assembled, blockades enforced. From China's strategic perspective, that era has an expiration date, and Chinese planners have been working toward it for a decade. China imports enormous quantities of oil from the Gulf region. The security of those shipping lanes is not abstract to Beijing. It is a structural economic requirement. Chinese strategists have argued internally that depending on American goodwill and American naval dominance to keep those lanes open represents a strategic vulnerability that China's growing naval capability should eventually address. Every Chinese carrier commissioned, every destroyer added to the fleet, every submarine launched, every blue water doctrine developed, All of it has been building toward the moment when Beijing could contest American operational freedom in a theater that matters to both powers simultaneously. The Hormuz confrontation was not improvised. It was the product of deliberate military development and strategic patience, waiting for the right moment. That moment arrived when American attention and assets were concentrated on the Iranian problem, when Gulf states were questioning their American security dependencies, and when a Trump-Beijing summit was scheduled, creating a specific diplomatic deadline by which Beijing wanted its message received. China does not move warships into a confrontation position on a random operational calendar. It moves them when the timing maximizes the message's impact across every relevant audience simultaneously. To Washington, do not underestimate us. To the Gulf states, China is a naval power in this region. To China's domestic audience, Chinese power is being demonstrated at the moment of maximum global attention. And to the IRGC and Iranian leadership watching from Tehran, the message was, Beijing's presence in the theater introduces variables that the American military architecture was not designed to manage simultaneously with the Iranian threat. All 4 messages were delivered in 30 minutes of course change and radio communication in 21 miles of water. Extraordinarily efficient strategic communication, delivered through naval assets rather than diplomatic language. Let's get into what the Chinese naval capability actually represents. Because dismissing Beijing's ability to contest American operational freedom in the Hormuz theater on the grounds that China's presence there is currently limited would be the analytical error that Chinese military planners have been banking on for a decade. China now operates multiple aircraft carriers. The Fujian, its most advanced carrier, is a catapult-assisted launch system vessel that can operate the full range of Chinese naval aviation. China's destroyer fleet is modern, large, and equipped with sensors and weapon systems specifically designed for the blue water environment that Gulf operations require. The Type 055 large destroyer, which Beijing classifies internally as a cruiser, carries the YJ-21 anti-ship hypersonic missile and a vertical launch arsenal that Western naval analysts assess as genuinely competitive with American surface combatant capability at comparable ranges. China's submarine force is expanding at a pace that no other navy in the world is matching. The Type 093B nuclear-powered attack submarine and the diesel-electric Type 039C conventional submarine, operating in shallow water littoral environments, represent a subsurface threat that American anti-submarine warfare assets in the Gulf region must now allocate attention to. The combined picture is of a navy that has grown from a regional coastal defense force in 2000 to a genuine blue water competitor that can deploy credible combat power to theaters far from Chinese home waters. The Hormuz confrontation was the first time that capability was brought into direct contact with American forces. Let me give you the specific operational numbers that define the confrontation's military context. At least 1 Chinese destroyer and 2 support vessels were involved in the course change. The American formation included a guided missile destroyer and support vessels from the carrier strike group. The confrontation lasted approximately 30 minutes from initial course change to resolution. CENTCOM issued an unusually direct public statement within hours, characterizing Chinese behavior as unprofessional and dangerous. Additional U.S. naval assets were accelerated into the region within 48 hours. Multiple Gulf state capitals received substantive diplomatic contacts from American officials. Conversations focused on base access, intelligence sharing, and contingency planning. China's denial was issued within the same news cycle, using the standard Beijing framework: deny, deflect, and accuse Washington of hyping a non-incident for political purposes. And the radar tracks, unambiguous in their documentation of the Chinese course change, were maintained as the evidentiary foundation. Now let's talk about the Gulf states. Their position in the current triangle of U.S., China, Iran competition is the variable that everyone understands is the most consequential long-term outcome. These are governments that have built their entire security architecture around American military guarantees, American bases on their soil, American weapon systems in their arsenals, American naval presence as the foundational guarantee of navigational security. That security architecture has been the bedrock assumption of Gulf state foreign policy since the First Gulf War. But many of these same governments have simultaneously been deepening economic and diplomatic ties with China at a pace that has accelerated significantly over the past 5 years. Chinese infrastructure investment, technology procurement, and diplomatic engagement at the highest levels. The economic future of the Gulf states runs increasingly through Beijing, while their military security still rests on Washington. The Hormuz confrontation forced every Gulf capital to perform a calculation it has been avoiding. If this escalates, whose side are we on? That question does not have an easy answer for governments that need both relationships simultaneously. The uncertainty it creates is itself a form of strategic leverage for Beijing. If China can make Gulf states uncertain about American reliability, those states might recalibrate their decisions. The Hormuz confrontation was not primarily a military maneuver. It was a political communication directed at the Gulf states, using naval assets as the medium. Now let's get into the pattern that the Hormuz confrontation fits into. Because individual incidents only make strategic sense when you see the larger pattern of which they are the latest data point. The South China Sea artificial island construction. The militarization of those islands despite international legal rulings against it. The Taiwan Strait exercises of increasing scale and threatening geometry conducted regularly against Taiwan. The East China Sea tensions with Japan that simmer at a level permanently above what most international coverage conveys. And now the Strait of Hormuz. Each of these theatres is geographically different. Each involves different specific actors and different legal frameworks, but they share a common strategic thread that runs through all of them. China is systematically testing the boundaries of what it can do without triggering a direct military response from the United States. It is probing American red lines by pushing against them, observing how Washington reacts, the speed, the nature, the intensity of the response, and then calibrating the next probe based on what the previous one revealed. This is not opportunistic aggression. It is methodical grey zone competition, operating in the space between unambiguous peace and outright war, where the most consequential strategic competition between great powers occurs without ever producing the clear triggering event that would require a definitive response from either side. American defense planners call this the grey zone. Chinese doctrine calls it something functionally equivalent, but framed in terms of comprehensive national power competition that includes military, economic, diplomatic, informational, and legal instruments operating simultaneously across multiple theatres. The Hormuz confrontation is a grey zone operation. Its success is measured not in territory captured or targets destroyed, but in the degree to which it shifts the calculations of every relevant actor, Washington, the Gulf states, other regional powers, markets, about what China's presence and capability in this theatre means for the future of operations there. Now let's talk about what the American response actually accomplished, and why the 30-minute response timeline is the most important strategic data point from the entire incident. The United States did not back down. That is the first and most fundamental fact. The American formation maintained its lawful course throughout the confrontation. The Chinese course change did not produce the outcome of American vessels altering their path to avoid contact. American forces held. That matters enormously in a grey zone competition context, because the entire Chinese probe strategy depends on accumulating evidence that American resolve has limits that can be identified and eventually exploited. If the American formation had altered course to avoid the Chinese vessels, that outcome would have been documented, analyzed, and incorporated into Beijing's modeling of American behavior. The fact that American forces held their course while going to battle stations is the operational record that Beijing's analysts are now incorporating into their model. But the speed of the diplomatic and military response is the detail that carries more strategic weight than the course maintenance. 30 minutes from the beginning of the confrontation to a coordinated diplomatic and military response already in motion. That timeline demonstrates that the United States had wargamed this specific scenario and had a response playbook that was ready to execute without requiring the deliberation time that a genuinely surprising development would have produced. China wanted to test American response speed and coordination. The test result was that American response speed and coordination in this scenario is faster than Chinese planners apparently modeled. That is the intelligence value of the confrontation for American planning. And it is the result that makes the confrontation a Chinese tactical success in its immediate signaling purpose, while being a Chinese strategic disappointment in what it revealed about American preparedness. CENTCOM's unusually direct public statement is the element of the American response that deserves the most analytical attention, because it represents a departure from the standard bureaucratic approach to these incidents that is itself a strategic communication. Normally, a confrontation of this type would produce carefully hedged language from official sources, with weeks of private diplomatic processing before any public characterization of what happened. Washington went public fast. They confirmed the incident without qualification. They characterized Chinese behavior as unprofessional and dangerous, and they made clear that American forces maintained their lawful course throughout. The speed and directness of that public communication signals that Washington made a deliberate decision to own the narrative, before Beijing could establish its own version as the dominant public account. China's response, denying wrongdoing, accusing Washington of hyping a non-incident for political purposes, claiming American vessels were the provocateurs, was the standard playbook. But it arrived after the American account was already established as the first public statement in every news cycle that covered the story. In information environment competition, the first credible account of an event has disproportionate staying power in public understanding, regardless of subsequent counter-narratives. Washington understood that and acted on it immediately. The additional naval asset deployment within 48 hours is the military track's answer to the Chinese presence escalation. China used presence as a pressure tactic, by positioning assets in the theater and then using proximity as a signal. Washington responded by increasing presence, not matching Chinese assets one for one, but demonstrating that Chinese asset positioning in the theater is answered by American capability acceleration that maintains an overwhelming advantage. That response also communicates to Gulf states watching the incident that American commitment to the theater is not a fixed allocation that Chinese probing can erode. It is a dynamic commitment that responds to challenges by increasing its expression rather than recalibrating downward. Gulf states watching that dynamic reach different conclusions about American reliability than they would if the American response to Chinese probing had been to quietly note the incident and maintain existing asset levels. Now let's get into the three tracks of the American response that made the 30-minute coordination possible. The military track was the immediate visible response. Battle stations maintained, course held, additional assets accelerated into the region within 48 hours. The increased American presence in and around the strait that followed the confrontation is not a reaction to the Iranian situation. It is the answer to the Chinese probe, sized and positioned to communicate that the probe produced increased American commitment. The diplomatic track was the 30-minute response that shocked Chinese commanders. Regional partner contacts initiated immediately. Gulf state capitals engaged in substantive conversations about base access, intelligence sharing, and contingency planning within the same 24-hour window. The explicit message delivered to Gulf partners, "We saw what China did, we responded, we are not going anywhere," is the diplomatic track's answer to Beijing's effort to make those partners uncertain about American reliability. The information track was the public statement, direct, specific, characterizing Chinese behavior with language normally reserved for hostile state actors, rather than the diplomatic euphemisms that characterize most U.S. China public communications. The information track's speed prevented the Chinese deny, deflect, accuse playbook from establishing itself as a contested narrative where both accounts had equivalent credibility. By the time China's denial arrived, the American characterization had already been confirmed by multiple defense sources with access to the radar tracks that documented the course change as deliberate and calculated. China is not going to stop probing. The strategic interests that produce the Hormuz confrontation are real and growing. China's oil import dependence on Gulf supply is structural and will not diminish on any time frame relevant to current strategic planning. Its naval capability development is on a trajectory that every U.S. Navy assessment documents as producing a genuine blue water competitor within a decade. Its domestic political incentives push leadership toward demonstrating strength rather than restraint in theaters where Chinese economic interests are engaged. Its grey zone strategy has produced enough accumulated evidence of working in other theaters that there is no institutional momentum inside Beijing toward abandoning it. China will probe again, and the next probe will incorporate the lessons from this one. The question of whether the mechanisms for preventing miscalculation, the naval communication channels, the rules of engagement protocols, the diplomatic back channels, are robust enough to hold under the conditions of the Hormuz theatre is what should be concentrating every defence analyst. The Hormuz theatre is different from the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, in ways that make the miscalculation risk higher. In the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait, the grey zone competition is primarily bilateral between the US and China. In the Hormuz theatre, the grey zone competition between the US and China is happening simultaneously with an active military confrontation between the US and Iran, with Iranian fast attack boats and drones in the water, an IRGC command structure operating through decentralized autonomous regional units, and a ceasefire on massive life support. A miscalculation between US and Chinese naval vessels in a theatre where Iranian autonomous unit commanders are simultaneously operating fast attack boats that they can launch without central authorization creates a compounding risk environment with no precedent in the post-Cold War history of US-China grey zone competition. One Iranian drone fired by a unit commander acting on his own assessment, one US vessel responding, Chinese vessels in proximity misinterpreting the American response as directed at their formation. The sequence that follows does not require any single actor to have decided toward escalation, only each actor to have decided what made sense from their individual position. The Trump-Beijing summit on May 14th and 15th is the diplomatic overlay on everything that happened on the water. Treasury Secretary Bessent confirmed Iran will be a centerpiece. Iran's foreign minister, Araghchi, visited Beijing in the days preceding the summit. China has been positioning itself as a back channel for reopening the Strait of Hormuz, telling Araghchi in direct terms that a deal needs to happen. Araghchi communicated back what the IRGC command structure will allow him to communicate. The civilian faction understands a deal needs to happen, but does not control the decision to make one. If Beijing walks into the summit having calculated that the Hormuz confrontation successfully demonstrated Chinese military presence, and that diplomatic progress on Iran should come at the cost of American concessions on Taiwan, semiconductor restrictions, or trade frameworks, then the summit becomes the most complex diplomatic interaction this administration has attempted in a single bilateral engagement. A 21-mile-wide strait, 20% of the world's oil, 3 nuclear powers, the United States, Israel, and a China that has just demonstrated its willingness to operate naval assets in direct confrontation with American forces, all present in or adjacent to the theatre. An IRGC command structure with no centralized naval commander, autonomous regional units, and a decentralized doctrine that allows action without authorization is operating hundreds of fast attack boats in the same water. A ceasefire on massive life support is the nominal framework holding this in a state not yet called war. The warning shot in the strait was not a bullet. But warning shots do not stay warning shots indefinitely when the conditions that produce them continue to intensify. China is not leaving the Hormuz theatre. The United States is not leaving the Hormuz theatre. And the narrow strip of water between them, 21 miles wide, is not getting any wider. Watch what comes out of Beijing on May 14th and 15th. Watch whether the IRGC's decentralized unit commanders hold their fire while the summit produces its outcome. Watch whether the Chinese naval assets that demonstrated their willingness to push against American formations move again before the summit concludes. The next 30 minutes in the Strait of Hormuz may not look like the last ones, and the 30 minutes after that may not look like either. Because when the conditions that produced a warning shot continue to intensify, warning shots do not stay warning shots indefinitely.